Good morning and welcome to our program Spotlight. On Spotlight, we usually focus on current affairs related topics, and today we will touch upon the topic of pharmaceuticals, and I think it's quite a concern out there and people are really worried to know more details about this. So we have someone who could explain this in detail to us and give us a better insight as to what's really happening. So we have with us Dr. Ravi Rannan Elia. He's the Director, Institute for Health Policy in Colombo. He's qualified as a doctor at the Cambridge University and a public health specialist at the Harvard University, and also he is doing his doctoral training in economics at the Harvard and MIT. He has been working on issues of health policy in Sri Lanka and other countries as well for the past 3 decades. So we have the best person to tell us more about this topic. Very good morning to you, Doctor, and welcome to the program.
Good morning.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, we'll be touching on pharmaceutical related topics and issues. So let's first and foremost talk about the shortage of medicine in the country. Do we have a shortage? This is for the layman out there to understand.
No, there's definitely a shortage. I mean, I don't have hard data, but if you speak to anyone and from the information I've seen, there's a shortage of medicines. There's a shortage of medicines coming into the country, and there's a shortage of medicines going out to pharmacies. There's also a shortage of the chemicals that are required to produce medicines in this country. And so I think, yes, there's definitely a shortage.
That's in a nutshell, but we'll touch upon the reason why we have a shortage, Doctor.
Sure. I mean, basically, the fundamental reason for this crisis right now is a foreign exchange crisis. So it's got nothing to do with the pharmaceutical companies, nothing to do with the health ministry. The country basically lacks foreign exchange, and that means that, for example, private importers cannot get the foreign exchange to place orders and bring in medicines, even if there are people in pharmacies willing to pay rupees for those medicines. So there are people willing to pay. The problem is that even if you have rupees, you cannot, as an importer, easily get the foreign exchange that you want to buy the medicines. So that is fundamentally the primary reason. There are a number of other reasons which contribute, but I think they're really quite secondary. I think the fiscal crisis is also linked with this, which fiscal crisis means the government doesn't raise enough taxes to pay for its expenditure commitments, so there's a great shortage of cash in the treasury. The other contributory reason, which has been there for some time, is the medicine price regulations, which basically set a cap on the prices of now most medicines. That is also making things a bit more difficult, because even if the importers can bring in medicines, they can get the foreign currency to do that, what they find is they can't sell it at a profit because of the price ceiling, because essentially the rupee price on the international market has gone up, and so that's also contributing to the shortage. But that's a problem that's been there for some time anyway.
Right. And Doctor, I understand that you've also done a poll before the elections with regards to this about, as you mentioned, about price regulations. So what was the output like?
Sure.
And I think we do have a slide as well.
Yes, and I'll just give a quick background. So, I mean, medicines and medicines access is really a very politically sensitive issue in this country, right? I would say, going back over 40, 50 years, probably the most sensitive issue in health. So politicians are very careful about medicine, so they worry about it, so it's understandable. But if you go back to the last administration, they introduced price controls on medicines, and that's one way of doing it. Now, the problem with that is, not everyone goes to the pharmacy for medicines. Poor people go to the Ministry of Health. So there are two ways we could have done this. We could have increased the medicines budget in the Ministry of Health, or we put price controls on medicines in pharmacies. So we asked people, just before the election, we did a poll 2-3 weeks before the presidential election in 2019. We asked people several questions I think are relevant. So the first thing we asked them was, what's your priority if you want the government to increase spending? And they say education and health. 2/3 of Sri Lankans wanted increased government spending on education and health.
So this was like an overall poll, isn't it?
Overall poll, nationally representative of Sri Lankans. And then we told people, look, for government to increase spending, the government has to raise taxes. Do you still support these priorities? Majority of Sri Lankans supported increased spending on health, even if it meant increasing taxes. So that's the first most important thing that you should need to know. Now, within the health budget, we asked them, what's your top priority? You can increase spending on the inpatient wards, on hospitals, on clinics, on lab supplies. The first and foremost priority, which is more than 2/3 of the voters were telling us, medicines. They wanted the medicines budget in government hospitals to be increased. Okay, so that's the second thing. Now, at the time, the policy of the previous administration, I think the previous slide, was that they introduced price controls. And so we asked the voters, if the government has to either control prices or increase the medicines budget, which it means increased taxation, which do you prefer? The majority of Sri Lankans preferred raising taxes and increasing the medicines budget over price controls.
So that was the priority, not the price
That was the
control.
priority. And it makes sense. If you look at the slide that was just up there a few seconds ago, the only income group which was sort of half-half was the better off. The poorer Sri Lankans prefer increased taxes and increased medicines budget. And let me just give you a little anecdote. I mean, I take a statin, which I recommend everyone at my age to do, is to keep my cholesterol low, right? It's a good thing to do. I buy it in a pharmacy. I'm better off. I benefited from that policy because I could upgrade to a better brand because the price came down. I ended up buying the American brand name, I won't mention it on TV, which is known for that particular statin. So I benefited in terms of reduced prices. The poor person doesn't benefit because they can't even afford to go to the pharmacy, right? So the better off people like me benefited, not the poor person. So I think what this is clear is that the public have figured, they aren't stupid. They're willing to pay money, increase taxes to do this. And one other thing, we did ask people their voting intention. And I think the last slide, if you can show that. And what we found was that even amongst the people who told us they were going to vote for President Rajapaksa, a majority of them favored increasing the medicines budget with increased taxes over controlling prices.
So let's make this a little bit more clearer to the layman out there. So which means, like, if we increase the taxes of the medicine or taxes to the public out there in terms of getting medicine into the country, this means the government will have, or state hospitals will have, more medicine to give to the poor.
Yes.
Right. So that's kind of what we gain through the increased taxes.
We would also say foreign exchange, because it turns out the Ministry of Health can purchase drugs in the global market far cheaper than small private importers.
Right.
So our foreign exchange costs would come down and the overall cost to society would go down.
So that's how they would benefit. And if I may ask you, how was this poll done?
So this is part of a larger research project which we did with several universities in this country, and also with the ministry. I won't go into the details on TV, but it was officially approved by the Ministry of Health. It was a nationally representative sample. It was part of a health survey, so we were asking them questions about their health, but we also added, just before the election, questions about what they thought about health policy and also their voting intention. So yes.
So Doctor, can you also touch on how the pandemic has affected this too?
So the pandemic, I mean, globally there is some disruption to medicine production and supply networks, which has resulted in an increase in prices. So that's definitely going on. That's not our primary problem right now. Our primary problem is that even if the medicines are available in the global market, we don't have the foreign exchange, the dollars to buy it. So how has the pandemic affected us? The pandemic, and I think our essential response to COVID was pretty good during 2020. But from late 2020, when we started to open up our borders, unlike some other Asian countries, we have had debilitating waves of infection. And that has disrupted our foreign exchange earnings. So I think the government made a mistake. They thought, open the borders, we earn foreign exchange from tourists. What they did not understand, and it was pointed out to them, was that, of course, having the virus spreading fast within the economy means that producers are affected. Workers cannot go to the factory because they're either infected or they're isolating. And that's had huge disruption on our local production for export. And so my sense is that our overall export earnings actually fell as a result of the COVID response after late 2020.
And also appointment of new staff to kind of cover up the lapse of people.
Yes, I mean, there's a huge problem. The government doesn't have money to employ extra people, even to pay salaries. It's struggling. The companies don't have money to invest. And if you're a big Sri Lankan exporter and you can do this, you will invest in other countries now. And I've heard that from top business leaders. I don't want to go into which companies. That companies which have the choice of investing in factories abroad versus factories here, some of them are choosing to invest in their factories abroad. And that's largely due to the failure to control COVID in the past 18 months.
So would there be an increase in medicine prices in the near future?
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. I mean, from the point of view of a person who cannot get the medicine, the price has gone up. I mean, I would say the price has become infinite, right? It cannot be obtained. But the pricing really depends on government policy because most medicines are currently price regulated. So I do think that, if you want to solve the problem in the short run, I think the price controls should be lifted and we should either have no controls or we should go back to the old price control policy, which basically said to importers, you can do what you want, you import it, but we will cap the price as a percentage of your import receipts. So that there was a sort of natural price limit. That's much more effective. It allows people to bring in the drugs, and if people have money, they can pay. So I think that will result to an increase in prices. The other thing is that, speaking as an economist, and I think most economists know this, to resolve the foreign exchange crisis, we will need a substantial devaluation of the rupee, and so that will, of course, push up prices. And that it will push up prices regardless of whether we import them directly or even if we manufacture them. And I think that's another point to make. Manufacturing locally is not a solution to this problem because we don't actually really manufacture the drugs. If you think about amoxicillin, it's a typical drug. If we manufacture amoxicillin in Sri Lanka, it doesn't mean that we have a factory that synthesizes amoxicillin. No, what we do is we import amoxicillin from a foreign producer, bring it to a factory, package it into tablets, and then sell it as Sri Lankan tableted amoxicillin. That's what local production means. So the raw materials come from abroad. So the important thing to know is that even with local manufacturing, we cannot avoid spending foreign exchange. So I think the reality is prices have to go up, either because they relax the price controls or because I think more importantly, they devalue the rupee and take measures to bring us out of this foreign exchange crisis.
So that would be like the solution to this?
No, I mean, the foreign exchange problem, we've had foreign exchange difficulties for decades. Our position is very different to, say, Vietnam. I mentioned to you just before the show,
yes,
Vietnam has suffered from COVID like us, but they chose to basically kill their tourist industry during the course of the past 2 years because they prioritized exports. And the consequence of that is their treasury, their bank accounts is overflowing with billions of extra dollars. Their surpluses they don't have a foreign exchange shortage. And why did they do that? I think one of the reasons is Vietnam, like many other Asian countries, but not Sri Lanka, has realized that the only way to become a rich country, if you're an Asian country, is to export. You have to develop your export industry. There's no shortcut. We have lost that idea, at least for the past 20 years. So I think if we want to permanently solve the foreign exchange problem, it's a kind of chronic problem for us, we have to get back to basics. We have to grow our export industry, and we have to do something about taxes.
Do we have some hope in terms of growing our export?
Look, I'm old enough to remember the late 1970s, early 1980s. Sri Lanka was one of the first countries in the late 70s, developing countries, to go for export-oriented manufacturing. China was another. We did it before the rest of South Asia, before most of Southeast Asia. In the late 70s, early 1980s, Sri Lanka was the fastest growing export manufacturer in the world. But since the policy stance changed in the mid-90s, and I will say this on air, following the death of President Premadasa, successive governments, UNP, SLFP, so I'm not favoriting any particular party here, successive governments dropped the ball. They did not prioritize export manufacturing. So yes, we can do it, but we have to have correct policies in place. Speaking as an economist, that means a competitive exchange rate. So for now, very big devaluation, but maintaining the value of the rupee at a competitive rate subsequently for decades, if we can. Secondly, we have to raise taxes so that we don't run huge budget deficits. We need the taxes to invest in our infrastructure, bridges, power stations, roads, etc. And then with that, our export manufacturers can expand. Now, I will say, there is in fact a new export opportunity for us which did not exist 30 years ago. I think it's possible for Sri Lanka even to become a pharmaceutical exporter, but I don't support domestic manufacturing just for the domestic market. I think if we're going to do it efficiently and in a way that benefits the country, it should be primarily export-oriented.
How about raw materials?
We just import the raw materials. So one of the things that happen, I'm not sure whether people know this, we traditionally get most of our medicines from India.
Right.
Because India is the largest medicines producer in the world, it's the cheapest producer, and we benefit. So we don't have to produce. We benefit from being 30 kilometers off the coast of India. But there's been a change globally. Indian manufacturers increasingly get the raw materials from China. China has emerged as more competitive in the production of the raw material. What the Indians are very good at is packaging it into tablets and retailing, selling it out in global markets. So there is an opportunity now, and some of the local manufacturers know this, we can actually now match the Indian prices, which we couldn't do before, because now we can directly import the raw ingredients from China, and we can produce them in Sri Lanka in a Sri Lankan factory. Now, for that to be really competitive, we need economies of scale. Sri Lanka is a small market, so the only way, it's like garments or anything else, the only way you can get economies of scale is through exports. So I do think there's a possibility of us becoming a niche producer. And
do we have the facilities to do this?
We have companies I know that are in the private sector who want to do this, who have an interest. What I hear from them is that policy has not been consistent. So we need a consistent policy framework, and there has to be part of an overall policy which is saying exports is the number one priority for the Sri Lankan economy. That also has to be there, because we get into things like exchange rates, customs, etc., etc.
Exactly. And we've been talking about medicine and about price controls, but let's talk about whether there is a monopoly on medicines.
I don't think there is. I mean, monopoly in what sense? Within Sri Lanka or outside?
Outside.
No, I mean, obviously the medicines market is a bit of an unusual market because governments generally allow companies to have temporary monopolies, but we call them patents when they develop a new drug. But let's be honest, most of the drugs that we consume here in Sri Lanka are off patent. Okay, so all the major drugs pretty much are off patent, and those are the drugs we import or produce. Those drugs, I don't think a monopoly is really an issue there. There are many of producers. I mean, I'll just give the example of statins. I mentioned statins earlier. If you take an individual statin like atorvastatin, which is widely used here in Sri Lanka now, if you look at the Indian situation, they have about 70 different producers. That's just India.
That's just one country.
One country. So these markets are generally competitive. Our problem is, as I said, we don't have the foreign exchange.
So that's to bring down the
down the medicines. And the importers have the problem that even if they import, sometimes they cannot sell it to profit because of the price controls.
Do we see anything happening, positive changes happening with regards to this in the country for the moment? Can we be hopeful about it?
I don't know. I think, like I suspect many economists are very fearful about the next few months. I think things are still in a negative trajectory. I mean, it does need radical change of direction. And it's not just for this government. I mean, they would need to do things which even the previous government was not willing to do. So I think I don't want to favor any particular political party, but there does need a radical change. People are talking, as you know, about the IMF. My view is that this is not really an IMF problem. I mean, we have to, as Sri Lankans, decide on what the best policy response, which means exports, devaluation in the short run, means getting our fiscal policy into balance. And that's what IMF supports. Where the IMF, I think, is helpful is that they can give us transitional funding to help us adjust. But in the long run, we as Sri Lankans and our Sri Lankan policymakers in both political parties have to make the decision to change the fundamental policy stance. Because this problem of this shortage of foreign exchange, in a sense, has been here since the 70s at some level.
It's just that the pandemic kind of increased the whole situation.
Not just the pandemic. I mean, I think at the last election, both political parties ran on manifestos of tax cuts.
Right.
That was a terrible mistake. At the time, Sri Lanka, for its income level, collected very little taxes. Countries at our income level typically collect twice as many taxes as we do. I don't know what our tax collection is these days, 8-9% of GDP. Country at our income level should be collecting 18% of GDP in taxes. Both political parties chose to run on platforms of cutting taxes, which is contradictory to their promises to help the poor. And the government that came in, President Rajapaksa's government, as you know, in the 2019 budget, cut taxes substantially. And that is also contributing to the foreign exchange crisis and also the general crisis. And I personally believe, terrible policy mistake. I have to say, as an economist, that policy may possibly, you could argue, could succeed. It was very risky. It may have, they may have gotten away with it in certain scenarios, but it was always risky. The moment that the COVID pandemic started in February 2020, the policy made no sense. Because there was no risk margin. The moment the pandemic started, there was no risk margin even to get away with that policy. So I think, yes, I think the tax policy is one of the major contributors.
Well, we see that this is kind of a global issue as well, if I'm not mistaken, because of the pandemic situation, and also people tend to make changes in the policies. So this would probably take some time, but what we need to focus right now is on the exports, isn't it?
We have to get our exchange rate back in balance, and I think it will be painful for everyone, but I think we need a substantial devaluation. The government needs to urgently raise taxes, and I think we need maybe to talk to IMF to get transitional help. If we're making the correct policy decisions, then go to the IMF and say, this is what we're doing, our own decision, but we need your help to tide us over until things begin to recover. And IMF can help in helping us, in terms of dealing with our creditors and getting additional financing support. But I think the fundamental problem is not the IMF. The fundamental problem is we have to choose the correct policies ourselves.
Right. So thank you very much, Dr. Ravi Rananeliya, for being a part of the show. We've come towards the end of the program. So thank you for sharing your insights on this.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much once again. So we had with us Dr. Ravi Rananeliya, economist and Director, Institute of Health Policy in Colombo. You've been watching Spotlight, and we'll do this all over again next week as well. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a pleasant day ahead.